Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming out for this conversation today that's especially relevant. It's getting more and more relevant. We're here talking with Matthew Powers and Ben Wallace-Wells about Ben's recent story and reporting for the New Yorker magazine on the increasing intensity of political violence in the United States. And Ben is a staff writer for the New Yorker, and he's also new resident of Seattle, and we're very excited because he's now a senior fellow at the Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy, and he's also an affiliate faculty in the department. So we're super happy to welcome him with this event, and just in general, it's great to have him in the community. And as most of you know, Matt Powers is a professor in the department and co-director with me of the Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy. And if you want to know more about news and events of the center, the QR code will lead you to something that will lead you to more news and events. So welcome and take it away.
Thank you. Welcome, Ben. It's great to have you here. So we're going to talk about your article, and I wonder if you could just start by telling us about the origins of it. So it's framed around the firebombing of the Pennsylvania governor's mansion. Obviously, political violence is huge. So just how did you decide to focus on it in this way?
I'd say there's sort of three steps to that, three parts. The first is just in my workaday life as a political reporter, I heard a lot more over the last couple of years from legislators, aides, people running for office about political violence as something that was messing with their perceptions of their job, changing what they thought they needed to do. It's just in the air in a kind of general way. And then at the beginning of the summer, after the assassination of the Speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives, Melissa Hortman, there was a story in the Times in which an Ohio Democratic congressman named Greg Landsman was quoted saying that every time he goes out in public, he has a specific image of somebody coming up behind him, shooting him, and him falling dead on the ground. And I thought that was pretty alarming and pretty different than the political situation that I'd come up covering. I thought I wanted to do something about it sort of then, but I was looking for a complicated case, an interesting case to sort of make the spine of the story. And as I sort of called around, the one that was most appealing to me was Josh Shapiro's story, the governor of Pennsylvania, which we can talk about in its specifics if you want. But there were two things that were appealing to me about that. One was that he is just sort of an articulate and, somebody who's capable of theory and abstraction and talking in an interesting way about dynamics in politics, but also he'd been on a bunch of different sides of this kind of thing, both because of his ambitions, but also because of Pennsylvania. So, Pennsylvania was the state that supplied the most, other than I think Florida, supplied the most demonstrators to the January 6th riots. He had run against a real extremist for governor the first time. He'd also taken a really active role in suppressing some of the student protests, pro-Palestinian protests at the University of Pennsylvania, sort of under the ostensible logic of a fear of violence coming from them. And so I thought this was sort of a complicated situation in which he was on a bunch of different sides. And so sort of decided to make him the spine of the story, and he agreed, which is nice.
Can you remind us of the particulars of that particular
instance?
Yeah. Just because
it's a crazy situation. Yeah. So Shapiro is a observant Jew, and that's a big part of his political identity. And on the first night of Passover, he's at the governor's residence in Harrisburg, which is his 29,000 square foot house. It's enormous. It's on the Susquehanna River. And he has a bunch of Jewish community leaders there for the Seder, but also about 20 family members. The Seder ends at about 2 o'clock in the morning. An unemployed local auto mechanic jumps over a fence, crosses a kind of courtyard where Shapiro often makes sort of calls late at night. He's carrying a backpack that has some homemade Molotov cocktails. He'd siphoned off gasoline from his lawnmower into Heineken bottles and stuffed rags inside. He's got a sledgehammer with him, which he says later he means to use to kill the governor if he runs into him. And he breaks a window, throws a Molotov cocktail inside, lit, breaks a window next to it, climbs inside. The room is still set up for Passover, so there's tablecloths dangling down from the tables. Those catch on fire quite quickly, and then the curtains in the room go up in flames as well. Shapiro is sleeping basically on the other side of a locked door with his immediate family and extended family. This unemployed auto mechanic, Cody Balmer, who has a florid history of mental illness, tries to kick down that door. And on the security footage, he looks really determined. He's kind of this wiry guy. He's got a scraggly beard, but he's trying really hard to break that door down. He doesn't manage to do it. The lock holds, and in about another minute, he's out of the window and away. The state police, there's 2 state police officers on the grounds. They go up to Shapiro's house. It's 2:30 in the morning, to his sort of chambers. It's 2:30 in the morning. They wake him up. They say the house is on fire. We've got to get out. We've got to get everybody out. He's got 3 of his 4 siblings, and their kids are sleeping in rooms around his. They rouse everybody. They get the dogs. They come downstairs, and they exit just as the firefighters are coming in. Balmer turns himself in the next day, says, I did it. There's a significant call to 911 that he makes before he turns himself in, where he says that he does this for his Palestinian brothers. Balmer has, again, a history of mental illness. He has no prior affiliation with any activist group. Even when you scour his Facebook posts, which people did a lot afterwards, there's not a lot of pro-Palestinian sentiment. He says kind of, critical things of both Biden and Trump. But nevertheless, that is part of the mix here. The next day, when Shapiro gives this press conference that's meant to be defiant, he's meant to say, if this is an attack on my religion or an attack on my acts as governor, I will be undaunted. But you can see how much of the building is damaged. This was a really serious attempt on his life, and pretty scary to watch.
And pretty early on in the piece that political violence is not new, and yet something in the past decade has kind of changed. So in what way is Cody Balmer kind of indicative of this kind of new type of political violence?
Yeah, I'd say there's a difference in scale and then also a difference in kind. And so one way to track the difference in scale is the U.S. Capitol Police has reports. They have tallies of reports that they get from members of Congress that say, here was a threat that I received. They're threat reports. And in 2014 and 2015, there were about 1,400 a year, which is a lot. It was not a picnic back then. Now there's 10,000, so 8 times as many. So that's one measure of how much the scale has changed. The nature, I think, is sort of more interesting. Because if you look, as I did in the course of this piece, at the assassinations and attempted assassinations of both Democrats and Republicans, political figures, over the last couple of years, sort of beginning with the attempt on Donald Trump's life in Pennsylvania and moving forward, is maybe 8 or 9 cases, and in not a single one is there a single co-conspirator named. So all of these people are lone wolves. And if you look back at the history of American political violence, you think about, the Ku Klux Klan, and the assassination of Medgar Evers. You think about the White Power movement that Timothy McVeigh came out of, much earlier, the anarchist bombings in Wall Street, at Haymarket. These are really thick with co-conspirators. They're people who have revolutionary intent, who are organized, where there is a clear path of radicalization. Right now, we see basically none of that, And so you have these lone wolves who, in some cases have somewhat legible motives, as in Ballmer's case, there's at least the suggestion, okay, I am doing this because of this belief I have. But in other cases, there's nothing like that. Thomas Crooks, the guy who came like a quarter of an inch from killing Donald Trump. We really know nothing of his motives, and he was not involved politically at all. And so, where we have this kind of familiar model where you have, subcultures that get implicated, like groups around an assassin, there's just none of that, And so just in tracking the way these events play in the media, there's often a first phase. It's like, who is this guy? What does he want? There's usually an attempt at a second phase, which is like, what group does he represent? What principles does he avow? What's the story about? And that's often kind of frustrating because it's not really about something that's distinct from the normal political discourse at all.
Right. And that's another piece of it that I found fascinating is that, at least in the past, it would be groups who would be, to whatever degree, outside of the mainstream.
Yeah.
And now it's often, I think, the killing in Manhattan of the United Health executive is kind of an example where it's like people are saying things, where even someone like Elizabeth Warren is saying, like, people
crazy
are so far. So
yeah.
There's been talk about.
Yeah, this is after the Luigi Mangione shoots Brian Thompson in Manhattan. Elizabeth Warren, who's no friend of violence, says violence is never the answer, but people can only be pushed so far, and I think that in a lot of these cases there is that element.
Now, John Shapiro has kind of like his own theory in the story. He kind of presents why it's happening. It's like young men who have a sort of like loneliness in the world, lost faith in politics, and then they get radicalized online. And I'm curious, like,
do I buy it?
Yeah, you buy it, or do you have a better?
I don't know that I have a better. I don't have a lot of answers here, but I don't really buy it. I would say, that feels to me like a story from 5 years ago, In a lot of the cases over the last couple of years, there's not a lot of internet, There's a couple of these perpetrators who, did seem to kind of self-radicalize, were involved in political community. But for the most part, there's little of that, And what's striking to me, and I think the thing you were alluding to a second ago, is if you look at the slogans that the shooters of the last few years sort of avow, and sometimes these are inscribed on bullets. There's like a very mimetic quality to a lot of this, where both right-wing and left-wing sympathizers are, building on some of the same patterns. Slogans inscribed in bullets, sent in text messages. They're very close to slogans from everyday political discourse, It's a guy who shoots at an ICE detention facility in Dallas in November, I think, a guy named Joseph John, and he writes anti-ICE on the bullet. A lot of people are anti-ICE. A guy who shoots up the CDC, last summer, blows the windows out of 140 offices at the CDC, and kills a police officer who responds. He's motivated by anti-vaccine sentiments. That's 40% of the country, And Tyler Robinson, who kills Charlie Kirk in September, sends a text message to his partner and says, I've had enough of the bigotry, anti-trans bigotry. His partner is purportedly trans. A lot of people feel that, These are not really revolutionary slogans. They're slogans that are borrowed from just mainstream politics. And so I think that one of the messinesses, or part of the messiness of this issue, is that the politicians in responding can't readily single out, here is the horrible extremist rhetoric from here is the normal political rhetoric. There's an act that can be condemned. But beyond that, it gets very messy and very difficult to say like where exactly the boundary of free speech and threat exactly lies.
And I can imagine even at the level of law enforcement, it's pretty hard to like actually figure out what's an extreme threat that has to be taken seriously and someone just blowing out steam. So I can imagine even at that level.
Yeah, and for part of the reporting of this piece was I spent time with people from the Capitol Police and also from the Treasury Department who investigate these threats. So the Treasury Department guy was follows up on threats to IRS agents, of which there are a lot, And when I started talking to them, I thought, okay, they'll have a clear scheme. They'll be able to say, here are the elements that make us take a threat really seriously. And here are the elements that make us say, you know what, this is probably just some guy blowing off steam. And what I found was that didn't really exist. The level of day-to-day rhetoric, I mentioned those 10,000 threats a year that get reported to the Capitol Police by members of Congress, which is, 30 a day, I think. I got some examples of those, and it is crazy. What comes in every day to Congress people is, we printed some of them in the piece, just so aggressive and hateful and, not politically defined. It's not just right-wingers, or left-wingers. A lot of people get these, get really alarming threats. And so, what I found in talking to those investigators is that they really do have to track them down. They really do have to go talk to the person who issued them. And there's, I don't know if you want to get into this, but there's funny and crazy things about this. The most common single threat that members of Congress get is somebody will call up their congressman and say, I've had terrible service at my local VA. I want you to do something about it. That's call one. Call two is, you haven't followed up and done anything about this problem I've got at the VA. Call number three from a different number, I'm gonna kill the congressman. And there is a kind of rapid escalation there from a very everyday, mundane, situation to something completely alarming and I think genuinely threatening to the people who receive it, the congressman on the other end. And we can talk about some of the effects, but another interesting pattern there is that the Congress people who are receive the most threats are those with the most reactivity on social media, the people who get the most attention for their posts, either for or against. So it's, you could get Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it's Nancy Mace, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's not the leadership, it's, how much of a public, everyday debating, point do you make yourself in your own opinions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the effects on who goes into politics, who leaves politics, how it actually affects the everyday life of being a politician?
Yeah. I mean, this is some of the stuff that most caught my eye when I started to poke into it. So there are some studies that say, there's a group at Princeton that surveys local politicians and has been doing so since COVID, township officials, school board officials, and so on. And they ask them, how often have you been harassed, questions like this. And something like in the 30s, 33% of them will say, I've decided not to run for further office because of the level of, harassment I get. But on a personal level, on a particular level, when you start talking to individuals, it can be quite striking and alarming how much they're pulling back. So, I talked to both Congress people and, county commissioners who have said they're basically no longer on social media and they're not advertising their events, so they'll still go to the senior center, but they won't say, I'm going to the senior center. The crowds are smaller, their engagement, democratic engagement is lesser, but that's the compromise they've made. I think there's also a lot of evidence that people are not getting into politics, that it's just changing who goes in. When I talked to Shapiro, he said that in the 6 months since the attack, 90% of the calls he got, and somebody like Shapiro gets a ton of calls from other politicians saying, do you think I should run for this office? Would you back me? Says 90% of those conversations are about security and not about the political dimensions of this. How do I keep my family safe? A woman I interviewed, Amanda Littman, who runs this, national progressive organization called Run for Something, which is a candidate recruitment organization. says she thinks that it's changing the profile of who is getting into politics, that you get people who are more determined, who are less focused on compromise, who are more brave, less scared. And so, I think there are a lot of pressures on who gets into politics, on what they do there. I think if you look at, I think the group that in some ways felt this the first are kind of anti-Trump Republicans who got hit with a ton of threats in like the 2017, 2018, 2019 period. A lot of those people are just out of politics now. They just couldn't do it anymore, And so, it's a whole what used to be a whole faction of the party that has been driven out in part because they're not as appealing to conservative voters anymore. They disagreed with the standard bearer of the party, but also in part because they don't want to put up with threats. And, that you could have just the shape of the party twisted a little bit at the margins, but twisted a little bit by the presence of threats, by our incapacity to deal with it. It feels like a pretty big deal to me.
Wasn't that Mitt Romney's claim about impeachment, that like impeachment might have stood a better chance if people weren't threatened?
Mitt Romney said other senators said to him directly, I would have voted for impeachment, except I'm worried somebody will come at me. Peter Meyer, who is a moderate Republican congressman at the same time, has said the same thing effectively. And Romney was somebody who spent, I think it's $1 million a year on private security as a senator, which not everybody is capable of doing.
So another conflation, you talked about it a little bit before, is like the conflation of political opponents with physical threats. And there it also seems like, obviously Trump is a very clear case of like doing that. But also one of the things you talked about is like Shapiro.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about what that phenomenon is and how you evaluate that.
Yeah, I mean, one situation that Shapiro had to deal with during this year leading up to the assassination attempt against him was that there were a lot of pro-Palestine protests on university campuses, and a lot of, his donors, were reacting very negatively to that, and we had this exchange, Shapiro and I, in his, residence, where, he eventually sort of pushed for the encampments to be cleared. There's an encampment at the University of Pennsylvania, and he pushed for, he said, I think that should be gone, and disavows any direct responsibility, but eventually it was. The Philadelphia police cleared the encampment. And we had this exchange where I said, how do you weigh free speech concerns against, what you saw there? And he said, well, I think it's very easy. I'm a former prosecutor. I draw a line where anybody is being harassed or assaulted. And when somebody can't walk across a quad without getting, stopped, pushed, bullied, that's a line that we can't cross. And I said, but that didn't happen at the University of Pennsylvania. There's no, evidence, no report even. There's extensive reporting of things that were said, some very nasty things were said to people, anti-Semitic for sure. It wasn't actually physical harassment, And he said, yeah, but it happened elsewhere. At other campuses around the country, you did have, Jewish students being stopped for being Jewish, pushed, etc. That's a line that might have seemed a little clearer and a little easier to navigate if you didn't have sincere worries, I think, that you might have a violent act behind it. Another example that feels very poignant to me right now is the ICE masks. The rationale that's given for the masks that ICE officers wear is that they might be doxxed, and targeted, and this incident I mentioned early on of the shooter in Dallas, that gets brought up a lot, at congressional hearings by Kristi Noem, et cetera. And, that's a profoundly anti-democratic thing, to have police officers operating without anybody being able to see. I think it's more an ostensible than a sincere safety. But there is some element of sincerity. They probably are at more risk than they might have been 20 years ago, And I think that, it's just another example of how bad everything is, of how how complicated it makes what otherwise might be more straightforward decisions when you have this element of personal fear that is, at least partly sincere.
Yeah. It's kind of a non sequitur, but when you were talking about the pen thing, one thing I noted is that the reporting that you actually drew from was actually a student report.
Incredible.
And one, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Two, we've talked about a little bit through the center, just some of the.
Oh, Greg, this is a big theme for you. Yeah. I mean, this is a guy named Ben Day, I think is his name. He's a reporter at the Daily Pennsylvanian who has just been absolutely bird dogging this story for 2 years and uncovered like all this through FOIA requests and university public records requests, uncovered all this incredible, detail of basically how Shapiro interacted with the administration behind the scenes and also interacted with like Jewish student groups and Palestinian student groups. And, I talked to this, I didn't quote him in the piece, but I talked to him and I said to him after the piece was published, and he sent me a nice note, that it's amazing how often, as local press has collapsed, we end up turning to university reporters, I mean, the reporting here at the Harvard Crimson, at Penn is essential. And like, this is an area where his reporting was specific to a situation in the university, but it gave us some real insight into how a major American political figure operated, and in this case, he like had installed somebody on the board. And, I talked to the chair of the board of trustees and he gave me like some of this story, but a lot of it was going on the Daily Pennsylvanian, the 20-year-old reporter.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think about it just because we had an event in the fall where the editor of the Daily here made the claim that they were the oldest and the largest newspaper in the city of Seattle.
Right.
And oldest is definitely empirically true, and I think they're actually looking at John because he's the faculty advisor. But I think it's true that actually there's a bigger staff of the Daily in terms of the Seattle Times.
Yeah. I mean, my very first thing I did in journalism was I was a metro reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I covered a tiny set of 5 towns. And Philadelphia's in a relatively similar situation. I would guess the Inquirer staff is still a little bigger than the DP's, but it's close, and the quality is also close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to come back to the piece, towards the end, you write about, I'm trying to remember the Utah governor, Spencer Combs.
Yeah.
His proposed solution.
Touch grass.
Touch grass.
Get off the internet.
Get off the internet, get married, have kids.
Right.
And
sure.
And you point out, I think you make a great point, which is actually, it's kind of a confession that liberalism can't actually deal with its own problems. If your solution to it is to get out of
Stop looking at politics. Stop looking at the news. You're giving the game away there. You're saying this thing can't be fixed, know.
And then, first can you say a little bit more about that? Because then I'm curious about the illiberal response that you read about.
It's tricky. The liberal instinct is to be inclusive, to listen to individuals and take their opinions as representative of just their own point of view, not, the political party they're affiliated with, not their racial or ethnic group, not their sex, you're just looking at a person as a person, And in this rush to say, I think somewhat, in bad faith, but also somewhat informed by our long history of dealing with extremist violence, to say, who does this person draw from? What do they avow? Who do they represent? There's a pretty quick, impulse to say, it's that group's fault, And I think that you see that coming up certainly from the right, from Trump and Republicans, also occasionally from the left, And to me, that's in some ways the kind of core danger in this, is that you have kind of collective sanction, collective punishment. That's sort of what Shapiro is doing when he's saying, I'm going to crack down on pro-Palestine protesters in this quad because of some things that happened in New York by similar groups, It's certainly what Trump is saying, when after Charlie Kirk's, assassination, he comes out and says, we're going to go after George Soros and the, liberal groups who are funding this. I think that political actors, for reasons both completely disingenuous and sincere, are not really making that distinction anymore. And so, I wish it were as easy as get offline, but I don't think that we're in a situation where there is something special about participating in online debates that makes you prone to threats or violence. And so, it doesn't seem to me like it's likely to solve the problem.
Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting about the collective sanction part is just, at least when I was reading it, is that partly it's a failure of an actually unified collective sanction. Right? It's like, someone comes out and says, this is not who we are,
Right.
And so you have it sort of partially like Shapiro when Trump, as the assassination threat goes and tries to do that, but then Trump in Minnesota doesn't reciprocate. And so to some degree it feels like kind of like the failing of center, as it were, like the liberal center.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I talked to Tim Waltz in the piece, and the governor of Minnesota, who's very close, he says my best friend, Melissa Hortman, in the piece. He's very close to the Speaker of the Minnesota House who's assassinated. And he said, right after this happened, the president blamed me, and I don't remember exactly what slur he used, but he called him a whack job, I think, Said, Tim Waltz up there's a whack job, the whole state's off the rails, and, no flags at half-mast, no call to the family, no visit, and so, there's a level at which both the stupid story and the smart story, this is all Trump's fault, and there's a level at which that's sort of true, I think, but there's just like a straightforward failure to, have that kind of, anodyne condemnation of violence that we expect have any traction, And so when people like Spencer Cox come out and say, he's widely praised for this, say, we've got to get off the internet and this is crazy. He's right, but also it doesn't change anything. Yeah.
And you write at the very end, and this is the part where I was rereading the article this morning, and I was like, oh man, this is
so dark.
It's dark, it's depressing. We talked about an emerging illiberal response, where the response to the lone wolf acts is state violence.
Yeah.
And obviously, the state violence part, you can't help but think about what's been going on in Minneapolis.
Who the president has called a domestic terrorist. Yeah.
And I wonder, for that, I wonder just your thoughts on it. And as I was reading it, I was like, I can't tell if we should even give that much of an account to the state violence. Are they actually responding to something, or are they instigating it themselves and then creating a narrative?
Yeah, I think it's pretty muddy, but, to me, the question about Minnesota, which is very active right now, very interesting, is just how much traction is the protest movement going to get? I mean, it's been pretty sustained, and in a way that basically no reaction has been in the second Trump term, and I think there are things that Trump has tried to say to weaponize, the possibility of political violence, fear of violence, that people are not swallowing right now. That people are sort of seeing through. And in the public opinion polling about Minnesota, I think you begin to see maybe a little bit of that. So I don't know if that's temporary or not, but I think that is one thing that is happening. There's been some overreach in this area, and I think it's registering.
So I'm going to open it up just because we've been going back and forth for a little while, and so just we can have questions, and just the usual reminder that a question is a question. So if you can sort of keep it relatively short, but we've got
a little bit.
About 35 minutes, so 15, 20 minutes of questions. And then
I'll do my best to keep it short. You start off writing about Governor Shapiro.
Yeah,
And you finish with Governor Shapiro.
yeah,
And in the middle, you report on something that's especially touching. He and his wife had the volunteer firefighters over to the governor's mansion to thank them for what they had done. The firefighters bring a letter signed by everybody, which includes biblical verses. The Lord make his face to shine upon you, the Lord grant you peace, and that. And you mentioned that this is very meaningful to Shapiro because he reads this to his kids every evening before they go to bed.
in Hebrew.
In Hebrew, okay? And so it seems to me the through line of the article really, although there are other things going on, the through line is really about Jews. Now you obviously don't see it that way because that's not how you structured it, but I wonder if that's something that you thought about and why it's not set up that way.
Shapiro's religion is very central to his political identity, important to him. I talked to Jake Tapper, who went to the same Jewish day school that Shapiro did, like 3 years ahead of him. And he said, this whole thing about political violence, this is a story about the Jews, Tapper said to me. This is about anti-Semitism, And you can take through a number of events over the course of these 2 years and say, that's what this one was about, There's a shooting of 2 Israeli embassy staffers at a UJA reception in Washington, D.C. There was a guy named Stephen Finder who is in Arizona and faced a lot of kind of election pressure, who's Jewish and says this is about anti-Semitism. When I raised this to Shapiro, interested in how he would articulate it, he was basically like, Jake is speaking nonsense. This is a set of pressures that have everything to do with the time we're living in, but are not specifically around Israel and around anti-Semitism. My own observation would be that, for somebody to commit an act of political violence, there has to be some urgency to it. There has to be a feeling that something is sliding off the cliff and I'm going to stand here and, prevent it. However crazed that individual might be, however irrational that assertion is. And I do think that on the left, the one issue that has, generated that intensity of emotion, is Israel and Gaza. And so it's not totally surprising to me that, a number of these incidents have an anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic sort of slogan around them. But to me, the patterns between left-wing violence and right-wing violence in this country are substantial. The mimesis cuts across those lines. And so I think that though it's an interesting thread, and certainly a thread in the story of political violence over the last 2 years, it's not the central story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the last couple of weeks in Minnesota and how it relates to the story, and if it's kind of updated your thinking in any way, or what your views are on how that relates to the core of the reporting you've done in the past?
I wouldn't say it's really updated my views. I'd say it's just sort of intensified the situation. One thing, the piece came out at the beginning of December, so before everything had really escalated in Minnesota, and I talked a bunch about the masking of ICE agents in there, as sort of an example of what was happening. There's a very clear thread, I think, of collective sanction around the Somali American community here, where that is the ostensible reason that all these ICE agents are in this area, because of a pattern of fraud among a few nonprofits, a few individuals. But now, there's a targeting of this whole community. That feels very relevant to all of this. I would also say just the descriptions of Renee Good and the accounts of the defenses of Renee Good, the protester shot and killed by an ICE agent, and the defenses of that ICE agent's acts, they very much emphasized her as a threat, even though there's, I see no evidence for that, but the president described her as a domestic terrorist, And so I don't know that I've updated my thinking exactly, but it does seem to me like very in line with a lot of the themes that we've seen in these episodes over the last couple of years, even though you don't have, I was talking mostly about assassinations and there's been nothing like that. Yeah.
Just wondering, you were talking about the lone wolf phenomenon, and I've just been thinking about, how political violence ties into that, and if you see any connection, because, you talked about how Governor Shapiro was talking about the kind of lonely online men, and I wonder if you see any connections between them and the other kind of mass shootings that we see in America. Are there ties to that or attention seeking? And you see in some of their letters some similar kind of disorganized political leanings or ideas about feminism and things like that. So I'm wondering if you see any ties on those two types of violence.
There's just a nihilism with some of these shooters, that feels much more like school shooting to me than like traditional acts of ideological extremists, I can't like statistically demonstrate that or something, but it's crazy to have an assassin of the president, attempted assassin of the president, where we just have no idea what his political intentions were, whether he had political intentions, that guy had searched, Thomas Crooks is his name, had searched for upcoming Trump events near him in Western Pennsylvania, also for upcoming Biden events, had mapped driving directions to both, It's a major event in American history that is pretty illegible. You definitely have stuff like that in the violence of the 60s sometimes too. But to me, like when I say I think there's something mimetic here, to me that's an echo of what happened with school shootings, with all of a sudden people were referring to other school shooters in their manifestos, and you had a kind of blossoming of that, and we haven't seen a ton of, direct quotation of a shooter in Minnesota saying, I'm doing this just like, the guy in Arizona did when it comes to assassinations. We haven't seen a ton of that. But to me, it certainly feels like that's part of what's happening. And, when you have this, this past year, just, one, and then 3 weeks later, another one, 3 weeks later, another one, and so on, just sort of through the summer. It certainly feels to me like there's something imitative going on, like we saw with school shootings, 15 years ago. So yeah, I think that's, I think it's a very live connection in my mind.
So we have this mental health problem that's involved in the background here, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we're trying to make sense of people who may have a mental health issue going on. And on the other hand, there's the culture that's in some way accepting that this is part of life right now. Maybe opening the door to allowing political violence to be an entity. Do you think that there's that the mental health part is playing more of a role for the individual? Or do you think that our culture is basically opening the door and mental health is, the issue that this person is struggling with, and they're walking through into a space that's accepting political violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big role for mental health, but I also wonder what the, solution is there. We've had, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, say 10 years ago, when we had a tenth of threats against members of the public, and we didn't have this spate of, attempted assassinations, a tenth of threats against members of Congress. We still had, people with mental health issues. They still, in many cases, were able to get their hands on guns, even if they were sometimes prescribed from doing so. And so I think at the level of the individual, there's often a pretty florid, mental health story. And, Cody Balmer is an example where, right before he tries to kill the governor, his mom calls 7 different police departments saying, "Can you commit my son? He's going to do something crazy." And she's interviewed, but they can't. The involuntary commitment statutes in Pennsylvania, he doesn't meet the standard for them, So at the individual level, I think a lot of these people are floridly mentally ill, but at the level of a pattern or like the societal change, I'm not sure that's the central culprit, And it's tricky because you're trying to see a kind of rational set of processes playing through people who are pretty irrational, But I think that is sort of the terrain that we're on here.
Maybe building on that, the way you described it in the article and talked about it today, there's a separation almost of like violence and political violence. But from the way you're describing it, it almost sounds like there's like ideological violence and kind of a culture of violence that are more parallel. I'm thinking about someone like Mangione, who has kind of a conversion story and like revered for an ideological reason that motivates for some reason his act. So can you speak to that? I mean, there's like, it almost sounds like a lot of the threads of these acts that are political are almost not, I mean, there is some ideology, but loose.
Yeah.
But then in reverse, what you were asking about Minnesota, that's ideological. So is there like, maybe it's the political is not the identifier, but a relationship to ideology is?
That's interesting. I mean, I tend to, I tend to find it a little bit hard to generalize among these 10 cases or whatever, 8 or 9 cases that I'm looking at closely, because in some of them, there's a pretty clear ideological commitment and story. Mangione is maybe the most lucid ideologically of any of these perpetrators. But Vance Bolter, the Minnesota shooter, was, had very straightforward conservative evangelical views. The CDC shooter, Patrick White, I don't know if you would call it ideology, but certainly had avowed anti-vaccine, beliefs. So there's an element. What I find kind of tricky is just that there are a lot where there's not, where it is hard to say, in any more than like a loose way, here's what this person was fighting for, here's what they believed, Cody Balmer is a good example of this. You have this like emotional declaration that I'm doing this for the people of Palestine, but he doesn't ever mention it again. He never talked about that before, There's a lot of these cases. Tyler Robinson, the Charlie Kirk assassin, when he's texting with his partner says, how long have you been planning this for? And Tyler Robinson says, a little more than a week. Crooks, the president's shooter, seems to have similarly like committed to this act right before he did it, And so because there's often not a clear history of radicalization, because some of these decisions seem to be made relatively spontaneously and soon before, I just find it a little hard to kind of generalize, even though what I'm trying to do in the article is like draw out some common threads, It's just a limit to how clear that can be. Does it make sense?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's time for one more question.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm just wondering how or why you seem to resist, and I love you for that, the kind of easy explanation where media and politics has come together, they've merged together, the attention economy and celebrity have kind of mixed, where people just want to get attention. And they ratchet up, like when it comes to politics and entertainment, you see newscasters and politicians just saying the crazier and crazier and crazier things just to get more and more attention. And we all know this is going on. We talk about it a lot in this building. It seems like you're saying but that's not quite it. That doesn't seem to be the answer. It's not about getting attention. And violence just seems to me on some level, we watch all these things get ratcheted up. People are saying crazy things. White nationalism is moving into the center of the of the discourse, that violence is just, it seems like kind of a natural progression. But you're kind of saying like, you seem to be kind of avoiding all that, and like even making fun of cops at the end a little bit, like.
Yeah, I don't know making fun of it. Yeah, I mean, maybe this is just like a very New Yorker thing where you're like, it's more complicated, like maybe it's just part of my disposition at some level. But I actually would return to the last answer I gave, which is just the deeper you plunge into the details of each of these individual cases, the less clear that pattern is. Cody Balmer, I think, was so beyond the pale nuts that I don't think he really registered this as an act of fame. When he's in the courtroom, unlike like Luigi Mangione, for instance, when he's in the courtroom, he doesn't make big statements, He's looks like a guy who's there for stealing a car, and he's giving his little account. He's trying to, not come off terribly, but he's not, using this as a stage to make a grand pronouncement, And there's a range here, Some of these people are, Mangione is an example, I think, of somebody who's very conscious of the attention and potential political, next steps that happen as a result of his acts, and tries to shape that in, the way he speaks. But it's just not the case with all of them, or even a lot of them, And one thing I do think is really interesting, and is sort of suggested by your question, is we're in a time when a lot of people who are not formally part of the political process, are not deeply ideologically lucid, feel implicated in it, and feel like a strong partisan of one point of view or another, which has a lot to do with the shape of our media and, the way the attention economy bleeds politics into persona. And, and there are people in the story that I talked to who say this is all downstream of social media, self-presentation and so on. I don't see it in enough of these cases to say that's the central thread, but it's definitely in there, and in some cases it is central. So yeah, maybe that's the note of my my resistance.
I get it. But school shooters and this kind of violence, there's a connection there somehow.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
Okay, maybe very quick. And then,
Yeah, well, I just building on that, at the same time that the attention economy is taken over, as we polarize so much and we don't actually talk and less gets done, I feel like everybody I talk to feels like there's no safeguards anymore. Like before you would be like, well, the Supreme Court will take care of that.
Right.
Nope. Congress will take care of that. Nope. Well, my state legislature. Nope. Right. And so there's this level of dissatisfaction that I think is much higher.
Self-reliance, maybe also,
What's up?
And self-reliance.
Yeah,
Self-reliance.
exactly. And then there's a tendency of a lot of people to go into God mode. Well, I'll solve this myself. And I'm not saying that obviously wasn't the case here, but I just in general everybody seems amped up and ready to cancel or do whatever and take things into their own hands. Tied into what you're talking about with the media culture as well. So
yeah, I don't disagree, and I think one of the things that I was sort of trying to suggest earlier is that that pattern that I noticed where the shooters are avowing very normal political slogans, that's pretty scary to me, because like if just watching the news is enough to make you want to go out and, try to kill a congressman or a governor or something, I mean, that's a position that a lot of people watch the news. A lot of people pay attention to it. If you don't need 5 years of entrenchment in like white power ideology to become so radicalized that you can, that you feel like you need to go blow up the Murrah building, if you just need to watch CNN and read Facebook and feel a certain way about it, that becomes a hard thing to stop. So that was part, I agree, and like that's part of what I was trying to allude to with that kind of observation.
oh, I'm not very cheerful.
Happy January.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.